If you watched the 2017 Ken Burns Vietnam documentary, or took a US history class in high school, your context for understanding the facts of the Vietnam War probably looked like this. The US prevented communist aggression from the North while supporting a peace process. In fact, here's a direct quote from an advanced placement crib note I found online. Quote, "The United States wanted to prevent the spread of communism through a policy called containment. To do this, they fought with South Vietnam against North Vietnam, which wanted to unify the country under a communist government." End quote. The reality does not support this. Basically, the truth of the war has been erased, so a new understanding is required for the facts of the Vietnam War.
It's chaotic. It's tense and it's relaxed. It's lonely and it's exuberant. It's poor and it's rich. It's strange and it's familiar. It's incredibly busy. This is Saigon, capital of a nation, heart and sinews of the gigantic American military command in Vietnam.
ABC Scope, the wide world of people and events. This week, the Vietnam War, Part 84. Mornings in Saigon begin with a Dawnbuster show with disc jockey, Army Specialist Kramer Haas. We'll join him after this message in just 1 minute.
Propaganda. Younger people who are being indoctrinated into the contemporary system of falsification really have to do some research to find out what is the truth. In the general population, people forget or don't care that much. And generally what you hear drilled into your head every day comes to be believed. 1. Viet Cong resistance was native to South Vietnam. In 1954, the French war to reclaim their former colony was lost. The country was divided temporarily, with the North under an independent Vietnam led by Ho Chi Minh, the communist nationalist. In the South, where French influence was stronger, a Western dependency was established. By 1957 and 58, terrorism and armed insurrection were on the rise in the Southern Republic of Vietnam. This violence represented retaliation and resistance to the increasingly repressive regime of Ngo Dinh Diem, the installed ruler. Most of these incidents occurred without the instigation of Hanoi, who urged patience. Southern resistance leaders, who faced being jailed and even executed, refused to wait and began acting on their own. U.S. Ambassador Dubrau argued that the South Vietnam government would remain under attack from its own people as long as the neo-colonial dependency ignored calls for improving the conditions of its people. Diem's alienation of the population was obvious. To his people, he was a dictator who was only supported by the northern Catholic refugees and those who benefited from his corruption. Tragically, he murdered many patriots who had fought against the French and Japanese. His rule was tied to the patronage of the U.S. To Vietnamese nationalists, Diem was a traitor and subservient to foreign power. That year, 1958, the National Liberation Front would form, a South Vietnamese organization of communists, nationalists, and the peasants who suffered under the Diem regime. The NLF was dedicated to the independence of the Republic of Vietnam from U.S. imperialism. 2. A war of aggression against the rural peasantry. The ruler of the Republic of Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem, alienated farmers by rescinding land reforms and courting wealthy landowners. Farmers were economically devastated. In urban areas, Vietnamese were dispossessed of whole neighborhoods, which were demolished to build commercial centers and expensive apartments for Diem's American sponsors. Fires razed sections of Saigon that were immediately built upon with new, wealthy developments. Few thought them to be coincidental. Diem's policies were needlessly cruel and destructive to the independent highland tribespeople. They were forced down into new villages, where they would be easier to control. On colonial war. The US tried to fight what amounts to a colonial war with a conscript army. And a colonial war is a very dirty kind of war. You're not fighting armed forces, you're fighting mostly unarmed people. And to fight that kind of war requires professional killers, which means mercenaries. The 50,000 Korean mercenaries we had in Vietnam were professional killers, and just massacred people outright. And the American army did plenty of that too, but it couldn't take it after a while. It's not the kind of job you can give to conscripts who are not trained to be murderers. It was a citizens' army, not separated from what's happening in American society in general. And the effect was, much to its credit, that the US Army began to crumble and deteriorate, and it became harder and harder to keep an army in the field. 3. The real war was against South Vietnam. No Dinh Diem had been chosen to run the country by the French puppet emperor Bao Dai. Diem canceled the elections ordered by the 1954 Geneva Conference and had himself declared president in a fraudulent election. He had little claim to legitimacy. The Vietnamese people that rose up against Diem's foreign-supported government in favor of independence would be the guerrilla soldiers that the US Army, Marines, Air Force, and Navy would spend the next decade and a half killing. The US didn't want a peace process or any successful settlement in Vietnam. A democratic government forming would mean the end of the Republic of Vietnam as a US puppet, as it would result in the highly popular National Liberation Front coming to power. In 1965, the US bombed North Vietnam, trying to force the Democratic Republic of Vietnam to use their influence to call off the NLF's insurgency. The United States knew this escalation would result in northern troops entering the South, which they could claim was northern aggression. Before that, there had been no northern forces in South Vietnam. That would not last.
Good morning, Vietnam. Our time is 19 minutes, 19 after 6 o'clock in the morning. We have all kinds of good music for everybody on this Dawn Buster for a Monday morning. Hope you'll come along and join us. This is your host, Army Specialist Kramer Has, the record man. Want to know a 9-letter dirty word? Inflation. Inflation is what happens when too much money starts chasing too few goods. It begins with buying too many piastres on payday and reflects in higher prices for food, taxes, souvenirs, laundry, and other items. Our time is 24 minutes after 6 in the morning. Kramer, the record man, in session with music, reminding you we'll have headline news for your information at 6:30.
Suppose that the country could separate itself from the American-dominated global system and carry out a successful economic and social development. Then that is very dangerous, because it could be a model to other movements and groups in neighboring countries, and gradually there could be an erosion from within by indigenous forces of US domination of the region. So this was no small thing. It was assumed that the key to the problem was preventing any successful national movement from carrying out serious social and economic development inside Indochina. So the United States had to destroy it through a process which would become the war against South Vietnam. 4. Domino theory, better described as leaving the sphere of US empire. Domino theory is real in a sense, but not based in ideology. What the US feared was a positive example of economic development that would inspire other countries to leave the sphere of US empire. Successful independence in Vietnam might inspire places like Cuba, Australia, Central and South America to pursue their own course to the disadvantage of U.S. business interests. The U.S. needed the economies of smaller neo-colonies to be completely dedicated to the export of raw materials and to be a source of cheap labor. If these countries got it into their heads that they could do whatever they wanted or what was best for their people, that would conflict with investment. The U.S. was also concerned with the economic regrowth of Japan in the 1950s and 60s, and needed to ensure that there were non-communist trading partners in the region. Independent communist countries would not allow the foreign penetration of markets that the Western economies need to thrive. In October 1963, officials discussed the wisdom of stopping a known coup attempt on Diem, his unpopular rule, and his poor stewardship of the Republic of Vietnam were becoming liabilities. After his murder, South Vietnam would spend until 1967 under control of a military dictatorship. The coup was effectively permitted to happen by the U.S. government and tacitly approved by Ambassador Lodge. In this final communique between Diem and Ambassador Lodge, Diem clearly fears for his life. 5. A Russian model of development. As displayed by the Soviet Union, the Russian model emphasized industrial development rather than the production of primary commodities, i.e., basing your economy on exports of wood, oil, or rubber. This had been the traditional trade relationship of colony Western nations going back to the 17th century, a classic traditional Western Third World exchange of manufactured goods for raw materials. It made the master nations wealthy and the subject nations impoverished and easy to control if they got out of line. Industrial development was a ticket to sovereignty. Russia, which had been a peasant backwater for centuries and used by the Western European powers as a source of cheap resources and labor, finally modernized under the mobilized industry of the Soviet Union. Comparing the standard of living in pre-revolutionary times to the standard of living during the middle 50s showed that a deeply poor nation could become a world superpower if the exploitive policies of the Western capitalist powers could be resisted. It was on this course that Vietnam would follow. The US empire was opposed to Vietnamese freedom, and thus the Vietnam War would result. So what did 60,000 Americans die for? In 1975, when America finally abandoned South Vietnam, the American oil industry owned $100 million worth of investments in the country. They were drilling offshore for oil for only about 1 year. The profits here would not go to the Vietnamese, they were American companies, subsidies of Exxon and so on. Oil is just one terrible example, there are many more. Stories about helping the Vietnamese save themselves from communism are very cynical, as the more honest picture is that the Vietnamese were saving themselves from us. What did 60,000 Americans die for? Fighting a war that was a lie from the beginning. If these lessons were taught properly, it would undercut some of the violent economic policies we champion today. Maybe. Did we learn anything from Vietnam? We learned not to trust the government, and yet we still called Kennedy Camelot, as if his administration wasn't equally terrifying to the rest of them. We gained a new consciousness about our actions abroad, and yet we're still unable to stop brutal wars for resource control like Iraq. We didn't learn anything important, and the propaganda cuts too deep to have any certainty about anything. It seems that the Nicaraguan Contra War, for example, was a repeat of Vietnam, Syria, Iraq, Iran, countless actions in Central and South America, with familiar players, adversaries, and objectives. In the case of Nicaragua, the U.S. would hire mercenaries to massacre and mutilate the Sandinistas, whose crime was to think they owned their country. Around the world, we tend to use money to arm violent groups to achieve goals of destabilization, such as the Islamic State in Syria and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Both of these historic groups were started with U.S. money and U.S. arms. The lesson the U.S. ruling class learned from Vietnam was to not use its civilian army in brutal wars of native suppression. After Vietnam, we would adopt the model of volunteer only. That effectively meant that anyone with economic means didn't have to go to war. Bourgeois Americans, the so-called upper middle class, don't have to worry about being drafted, and so their voice is no longer anti-war by necessity. They can let the poor fight for them, those who are desperate for the socialist benefits of service, and they can largely forget why we're at war, or that we're at war at all, as in the case of Iraq and Afghanistan. The military has a free hand because there's very little public pressure to be accountable to now. That's probably the reason these lessons aren't taught. We don't teach these lessons because the empire wants business as usual. If you tried to interfere with the status quo of the empire, I can't imagine things would go very well for you. Maybe you'd end up in jail or discredited. Possibly worse. In any case, anything productive that would actually disrupt the method of our empire is illegal. Because that's the point of the law, obviously, to protect our business dictatorship. In any case, be safe, and remember, good citizens don't ask questions. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned a lot, as I did while making this video. If you enjoyed what you just watched, like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you'd like to see more like it, consider giving to our Patreon. Follow us on Twitter at FolkPie. The sources for this video are listed below, and if you'd like to get in contact for collaborations or just to start a dialogue, my email is folkpie.lw@gmail.com.